Hi everyone, welcome back to Tech Booth. Today we're looking at 11 basic steps to get you going shooting video on your Canon EOS R. Step number one seems really obvious, but even experienced people sometimes forget this. Make sure you have charged batteries before you shoot. The Canon comes with a charger and one battery, and I'd recommend that you get yourself extra batteries. Now if you buy the original, it's really expensive, but you can also go with generics. They cost a fraction of the price of your original batteries, and most of them come with a charger. So for my Canon, I have one original and two generics that I got as backups. I've not had any issues with generic batteries myself, but some people would tell you to stay away from them. So if you can afford originals, then always buy original batteries, but you can also use generics. Step number two is to insert your SD card, which you do on the side here. The EOS R only has one card slot. I recommend that you get SDXC cards and get the fastest that you can afford. Once you have your card in your slot, make sure you format it in the camera. One thing about the Canon that I found the hard way is that it is very sensitive to the file format on the SD card. And so if you record anything on there and it has not been formatted, you can actually lose your information. So make sure you format your card in the camera, not in the computer, before you use it. The Canon EOS R has a touch screen, so once you are in the menus, you can navigate using your finger on the touch screen, or you can use the dials to make the different adjustments, and then the set button on the back to accept any adjustments that you've made. The next step is to switch from photo mode to movie mode on your camera. Unfortunately for this camera, it's not so obvious how to go about that. What you do is you press the mode button on the top here, and then you are presented with a menu, and what you want to do then is to press on the info button, and when you press the info button, it toggles between photo mode and movie mode. Once you get into movie mode, you are presented with 8 icons that you choose from depending on how you want to shoot your movie. You can have it on auto, and with the auto mode, the camera decides all your settings for you. All you need to do is to press the record button and off you go. And then the next one is your program AE, which is like a semi-automatic mode. And then you have your shutter priority, aperture priority, and finally your manual mode. You can start off with the auto mode and see how that works for you. If there's not a lot of light changes in the scene, the auto mode should work fine. But I recommend when you're shooting movies to always use the manual mode, and you make all the decisions for yourself and set the exposure exactly the way you want it. Step number 4 is choosing your recording system. You're going to either be shooting in PAL or in NTSC. Simply put, NTSC is used in the United States of America and a few other countries, and PAL is used in the rest of the world. PAL and NTSC used to be really important when you were dealing with analog video. But now that we are dealing with digital video and we have editing programs that can pretty much handle any system, it's not as crucial. But I would recommend that as you go into the menu, choose the system that is compatible with your region. You also want to choose the correct system for your region because of the electricity supply. When you're shooting in places where there are TV screens and there are lights that are on, you might get flickering if you're not using the correct system. And that has to do with the frequency at which AC power oscillates. The next thing you want to do is to select your frame rate and resolution. Now, depending on what system you're using, PAL or NTSC, you're presented with different frame rates. In PAL, the standard frame rate for shooting video is 25 frames per second. And then you can also shoot at 50 frames per second, especially when you want to slow down your video in post for slow motion. In NTSC, you have 30 frames per second for standard video and 60 frames per second if you want to slow down the video later in post-production. You also want to shoot at the higher frame rates, 50 and 60, if you are shooting a lot of action. There's an additional frame rate 24 frames per second that a lot of people will say is the best to shoot if you want to get that film look or cinematic look. Now, frame rate is just one in a lot of things that you need to consider to get that film look. The reason you'd go for 24 frames per second is because that is what is used in traditional film and it gives you the most natural motion blur. With the frame rate, you're also going to be choosing your resolution, and you're basically going to be using two resolutions. One is HD. This is the normal high definition resolution, and most of the time that's what you're going to be shooting at. So you can also choose 4K, but when you're shooting in 4K, make sure that you have the SD cards that are fast enough to record the 4K, and you also have the computing power to deal with the larger files. The next thing you want to set is your picture style, and that's basically how you want your footage to look. You have a lot of different picture styles and you can just experiment with those to see what you like best. In addition to the picture styles, you can actually shoot in what is called log. Log footage is flat and desaturated. The advantage of shooting in log is that it preserves your highlights and your shadows so that when you go into post, you have much more flexibility in recovering those very bright areas and those dark areas without introducing much noise. There's a whole process for working in log, so if you're just starting out, I would just keep that off. The next thing we want to do is to set our white balance. And setting white balance is a way of telling your camera what white looks like in your lighting conditions. If you don't set the white balance correctly, you might get a bluish image or an orangish image when you shoot. There are basically four ways in which you can set your white balance. One is auto, which is a good place to start if you're just starting out. The other one is using presets, and you'll see the different presets in there and with the icons explaining what kind of conditions work for each preset. So you can actually just go through each of those and experiment and see which gives you the best image. The other two ways of setting your white balance are to dial in a particular value or to do it manually. As you're starting out, I'd recommend that you just use the auto white balance to start off with and then move on to using the presets and see which ones you like. And then as you get to have more experience, you can actually dial in your white balance using the Kelvin values or do it manually. The next step is to set your audio levels. You can either have manual or automatic audio levels. The auto option does exactly what it says. It's automatic, so the camera decides for you what the levels should be without clipping. In the manual option, you have to set that yourself. So if you're doing something like an interview, then you get the person to speak and you set your levels so that there is no clipping and it's not too low. It's important to set your audio levels well, because if the audio levels are too low, then you have too much noise when you try and adjust them upwards in your editing software. If it's too loud, then you get clipping and you won't be able to recover that audio once it clips. The internal mic on your camera is not the best, but it's somewhere to start. I'd recommend that you invest in an external microphone for better audio. You can even go a further step up if you can afford it and buy yourself a field recorder to use with your camera. The final three steps involve setting your exposure, and we do this by dealing with what we call the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is a set of three parameters that we use to adjust our exposure. The first one is setting your ISO. Simply put, ISO is the sensitivity of your sensor to light. The lower the number, the less sensitive it is to light, and so you get a darker image, and the higher the number, the more sensitive your sensor is to light and you get a brighter image. The general rule with ISO is to keep it as low as possible. With the Canon, the lowest is 100. If you can keep it at 100 and still get a good exposure, then keep it at 100. The higher you go with the ISO, the more digital noise you introduce to your image. With today's cameras, you can push your ISO quite high, and so if you're in low light conditions, you can go up as far as 3200 and even beyond and still get a usable image. For video production, you should basically fix your shutter speed. And there's a rule that we use to fix our shutter speed. The rule that we use for fixing our shutter speed is called the 180-degree shutter rule. And what it says is that your shutter speed should be double the frame rate. So whatever frame rate you're using, set your shutter speed to double that. If you're shooting at 25 frames per second, then make sure that your shutter speed is 1/50th of a second. There are situations where we break the rule for creative purposes, but this is a good foundation rule to use every time you're shooting. To adjust your shutter speed, you can simply tap on the touch screen on the far left option and make the necessary adjustment, or you can use the front dial to dial in your shutter speed. With those two fixed, then you go to the final adjustment just before shooting, and that is setting your exposure using your aperture. Aperture is the opening of the iris in your lens. And so the wider the opening, the brighter your image, and the smaller the opening, the darker the image. Aperture values are measured in what are called f-stops. And so you typically see it written as f something. Now it can be a bit confusing because the smaller the number, something like f2.8, the larger the aperture. And the bigger the number, something like f22, the smaller the aperture. This has to do with the fact that that number is actually 1/2.8 and 1/22. To change your aperture, you can access the function on the touch screen, and you just touch and make the necessary adjustments on your touch screen by sliding left or right, or you can use the rear dial to do the same thing. Your aperture affects two things. One is your exposure, and the next one is your depth of field. What depth of field is, simply put, is how blurry your background is going to be compared to your subject. And so when you have large apertures, they cause what is called a shallow depth of field, and that means just a little bit of your subject will be in focus and everything in front and behind will be out of focus. And you get this bokeh effect that is quite desirable, where your background is out of focus and your subject stands out. If you're shooting landscapes or crowds where you want a lot of things in focus or everything in focus, then you need to have small apertures as you shoot. For such scenarios, you're looking at apertures typically above 5.6 thereabouts going up. Now remember, when you have the smaller apertures above 5.6 going up, you're also going to have a darker image, and so you might need to go back and adjust your ISO to compensate for the loss of light due to the smaller apertures. And so as you're shooting, you are playing with your aperture and your ISO to get the right exposure, but always keep your shutter speed the same. And there you are, 11 basic steps to get you going shooting movies on your Canon EOS R. Well, see you next time on Tech Booth.